Normally, the Prince of Wales can expect to become king someday, but that doesn't always happen. In fact, in the 750 years since England took control of the Principality of Wales, there have been 8 princes of Wales who never became king. In this week's video from History Calling, we look at the stories of these Plantagenet, Tudor, Stuart and Hanoverian boys and men, from the ones who died before their fathers to those who were exiled and denied their thrones and possibly shouldn't even be on this list. You'll have to watch and let me know at the end if you think I should have talked about them or not. Wales had its own princes before it was taken over by the English in 1284. However, they are not within the purview of this video. Instead, I'm going to be looking at some of those who held the title of Prince of Wales because they were the eldest surviving son of the English, later British, monarch. This video is a companion piece to my video from a few weeks ago on all the princesses of Wales since that country's political union with England, so make sure you check that one out after this is over. I'll leave it linked on screen and below for you. Like that video, the biographies I give here are just going to be little taster bios of these men's lives, as I don't have time to give exhaustive accounts of their experiences. The first man on our list today is Edward of Woodstock, son of Edward III and Philippa of Hainaut, and known to history as the Black Prince. I have a video explaining this nickname which I'll leave linked for you, so I'm not going to get into it any further here. Prince Edward was born at Woodstock, thus the name, on the 15th of June 1330, and we know very little about his childhood. He had to grow up fast though, and by the age of 7 he was already deputising for his father when foreign dignitaries were visiting England. At the tender ages of 8, 10 and 12, he was named Custos Angliae, the guardian of England, when his father was out of the country. In April 1343, he was created Prince of Wales, and this seems like a good time to clarify something which I think trips people up at times. The eldest son of the monarch is not born the Prince of Wales, assuming his father is already on the throne, nor does he automatically become Prince of Wales when his father ascends to the throne. The title has to be formally granted to him. In 1345, the young prince was ready to become a soldier, and after being knighted by his father, he fought at the Battle of Crecy in 1346. The English were victorious, and tales of the teenaged Edward's fighting prowess and bravery became legend. It was also at this time that he adopted the ostrich feather as his emblem to honour the memory of King John of Bohemia, and this symbol has been associated with the Princes of Wales ever since. Edward continued to engage in military campaigns, coming close to death on some occasions, including in a sea battle with the French in 1350, when he and his father seem to have survived drowning only because they managed to fight their way off their sinking ships and onto the still floating Castilian fleet they were engaging. One of his best known battles was that of Poitiers in September 1356, in which the English beat the French and captured their king, Jean. Although various marriages were proposed for him from the time he was an infant, in 1361 he was still unwed, and at that point he shocked the country by secretly marrying his father's widowed half-cousin, Joan, Countess of Kent. She had been brought up in Queen Philippa's household, was in her 30s, had already had a secret marriage at the age of 12, followed by a second forced marriage, a contested annulment, and a finding that she had spent years living in bigamy, and so she probably wouldn't have been King Edward's first choice for a daughter-in-law, but he made the best he could of it. King and Prince managed to retroactively get the papal dispensation to allow for this union, and the Prince and Princess went on to have 2 sons, the younger of whom was the future Richard II. They were also named Prince and Princess of Aquitaine for a time, and spent much of their married life there, though Edward's financial demands on the duchy and autocratic manner made him unpopular with many. The family returned to England in 1371. The final years of the prince's life were marked by increasingly poor health, possibly dysentery, and in 1376 he died at Westminster Palace just shy of his 46th birthday. He was buried in Canterbury Cathedral, where this magnificent tomb was erected for him. It was to be 200 years before another such upset to the line of succession was caused by the death of a Prince of Wales. But then, in the late 15th and early 16th centuries, 3 such deaths occurred in the space of barely 40 years. The first of these was another Edward, this time Edward of Westminster, son of Henry VI and Margaret of Anjou. Born on the 13th of October 1453, while his father was in the midst of a complete mental breakdown and created Prince of Wales in 1454, Edward was the only child of his parents' union and lived a life completely overshadowed by the Wars of the Roses. This conflict saw 2 separate branches of the Plantagenet family, known as the Yorks and the Lancasters, and both descended from Edward III, fight over the English throne across several generations. Henry VI and his son were Lancastrians, shown here in red, but the king proved unable to hold on to his throne and was deposed in 1461 by the 18-year-old Edward IV, who was a Yorkist. You can see that branch of the family in white. The young Lancastrian Prince of Wales, who had been disinherited, and his mother were forced to flee into exile in Scotland to escape King Edward, while his father remained in the new king's custody. With the help of the Scots, mother and son tried to retake the throne, but though they managed to get King Henry back, they could not topple Edward IV. The family fled back to Scotland, and eventually Margaret and her child ended up in her homeland of France, while Henry VI was recaptured by Edward IV in 1465. In 1470, Edward IV's cousin and brother, the Earl of Warwick and the Duke of Clarence, defected to the court of Edward of Westminster and Margaret of Anjou, and as part of the deal the group made to help put Henry VI back on the throne, it was agreed that the Prince of Wales would marry Warwick's younger daughter, Anne Neville. The wedding took place in December when the prince was 17. Initially, it looked like everything was going to plan. Prince Edward's new in-laws succeeded in ousting Edward IV and placing Henry VI back on the throne, but only for 6 months. King Edward, who had fled England, returned in March 1471, his brother Clarence came back to his side, and Warwick and his army were defeated at the Battle of Barnet on the 14th of April, where Warwick himself was killed. It was the same day that Edward, his mother, and his new wife landed in England, and they found themselves immediately on the back foot. They began marching towards the forces of Henry VI's half-brother, Jasper Tudor, but they never made it. Edward IV caught up with them at Tewkesbury, and there, on the 3rd of May, the Prince of Wales was killed, still only 17 years old. His wife and mother were taken prisoner, and his father died, probably murdered, before the month was out. The next Prince of Wales, who never made it to the status of king, was yet another Edward. Last one, I promise. This was Edward of Middleham, and his father was Richard III, brother of Edward IV and the Duke of Clarence. This Edward was born in the mid-1470s, though we don't know exactly when, and his mother was none other than Anne Neville, widow of Edward of Westminster and former Princess of Wales herself. In 1478, this little boy was created the Earl of Salisbury, but we know virtually nothing else of his life until 1483. In that year, his paternal uncle, Edward IV, died, leaving the throne to his eldest son, the new 12-year-old Edward V. Within just a few months, though, Edward of Middleham's father, then the Duke of Gloucester, had seized the throne for himself and locked up Edward V and his brother, who have become known as the Princes in the Tower. They were never seen again. Now the son of the king, little Edward went from being the Earl of Salisbury to a prince, and then, on the 24th of August, Prince of Wales. He was invested with his new title on the 8th of September at York, but his tenure was to prove one of the shortest on record. The following March, he died at Nottingham, aged no more than 10. We aren't sure where he was buried. In August 1485, Richard III was defeated at the Battle of Bosworth by Henry Tudor, who became Henry VII, and barely a year later, on the 19th of September 1486, Henry and his wife, Richard's niece, Princess Elizabeth of York, welcomed the next Prince of Wales on our list, their son, Arthur. Before we get to the Tudors, if you're enjoying this content, please remember to give the video a thumbs up and subscribe to the channel with the notification bell switched on so you never miss an upload or a community post. You can also find me over on Instagram, where I post at least once a week, and on Patreon, where I share bonus material including early access to ad-free videos, mini podcasts and blog posts. As always, a big thank you to everyone who already supports me on that platform, as well as those of you who make one-off donations to the channel using the thanks button underneath videos. Prince Arthur was born at St Swithin's Priory in Winchester. He was christened at Winchester Cathedral when he was 5 days old, and was named after the mythical King Arthur, known for leading the Knights of the Round Table. Unfortunately, Prince Arthur wouldn't have a chance to live up to the exploits of his namesake. He was created Prince of Wales on the 29th of November 1489 and raised in his own household, where he received an excellent education and was, according to the scant information we have, academically gifted. He gathered up a slew of honorary titles during his childhood, including being the King's Lieutenant when Henry was absent in France when Arthur was 6, but he doesn't really step out from the shadows until preparations for his marriage were underway, for it is Arthur's wife and their very short union which are his real claim to fame. The chosen bride was the Spanish princess Catherine of Aragon, daughter of the joint monarchs Ferdinand of Aragon and Isabella of Castile. Plans for the marriage were discussed in 1488 and confirmed in the Treaty of Medina del Campo in 1489. There was a proxy betrothal in 1497 and 2 proxy marriages in 1499 and 1500 respectively, but it was only in 1501 that the main event took place. Catherine arrived in England on the 2nd of October that year, and she and Arthur, both 15 at the time, went through an in-person marriage ceremony in St Paul's Cathedral on the 14th of November. In December, they set off for Ludlow Castle in Shropshire, from where Arthur would rule the Welsh marches on his father's behalf. Tragically, just a few months later, on the 2nd of April 1502, he died, possibly of pneumonia, tuberculosis, or influenza. No one's really sure. His 16-year-old wife, who had also fallen ill, survived and went on to marry Arthur's brother Henry VIII in 1509. None of their sons lived long enough to be created Prince of Wales, though, and decades later she found her short marriage to the elder Tudor brother under the microscope, when Henry claimed that their own union was invalid because she was his sister-in-law. Catherine maintained that she and Arthur had never done the deed, but it didn't stop Henry annulling his marriage to her so that he could wed Anne Boleyn, and demoting Catherine from Queen back to Dowager Princess of Wales. Whether she was telling the truth about her and Arthur's conjugal relationship remains to be seen. The Prince of Wales himself was buried in Worcester Cathedral and a magnificent tomb erected over his remains. The Plantagenets and the Tudors had produced some dramatic and tragic Princes of Wales, but not to be outdone, the Stuart family, who were their successors to the crown, which now encompassed England, Wales, Scotland and Ireland, brought their own drama to the title. They inherited the throne in 1603 upon the death of Elizabeth I, and the new king, James VI of Scotland, also known as James I of England, already had a son and heir, Prince Henry Frederick. This boy should have become Henry IX, but as I'm sure you know, that never happened. So let's find out how his story actually ended. Henry was born on the 19th of February 1594 to James and his wife Anne of Denmark, and was initially raised, much against his mother's will because she wanted to have custody of him herself, at Stirling Castle by the Earl of Mar. As the heir to the throne of Scotland, he had an excellent education and was especially interested in sports, horse riding, and all things military and naval. Upon his father's elevation to King of England, the prince automatically became Duke of Cornwall, but was supposed to stay in Scotland to continue his education while his parents went to London. However, after James had left, the pregnant Anne went to Stirling Castle in May and refused to leave without her eldest child. In fact, she was so enraged and upset about the matter that she suffered a miscarriage. Eventually, James gave in, and mother and son travelled to London together in June. His father set him up with his own household at Oatlands Palace in Surrey, but his mother had that household dissolved the following year, and thereafter Henry bounced around the major royal palaces where she was staying and saw her frequently. His interests in political and military matters were noticed abroad and commented upon positively, and plenty of foreign houses sought him as a husband for one of their daughters. A match with Spain was suggested, but fell through, and Henry was, in any case, keen to have a Protestant wife, telling his father that "two religions should never lie in my bed." At his own insistence, he was created Prince of Wales in June 1610 at the age of 16. The lavish ceremony took place at Westminster Palace in front of both Houses of Parliament and was compared to a coronation in terms of its spectacle. In the remaining years of his life, Henry also showed a serious interest in the arts and was possibly on course to be a great Renaissance king. But then, in October 1612, it all fell apart. He came down with suspected typhoid, and within 3 weeks this promising young heir to the throne was dying, expiring on the 6th of November at the age of just 18. He was buried in Westminster Abbey, and it was his younger brother Charles who ultimately became monarch, which must lead us to wonder if the English Civil Wars, Charles's execution in 1649, and the temporary abolition of the monarchy could have been avoided if only Henry IX had been on the throne instead. The monarchy was restored in 1660, and the throne given to Charles I's son, Charles II. But when he died without any legitimate children in 1685, it went to his brother, the Catholic James II. At that time, James had only 2 daughters, the Protestant Mary and Anne, who came from his first marriage. Then, in 1688, all that changed. On the 10th of June, James's second wife, Queen Mary of Modena, gave birth to a healthy boy named James Francis Edward Stuart, who was made Prince of Wales on the 4th of July. Before he was 6 months old, though, he had lost his birthright, and his title was disputed for the rest of his life. Horrified at the thought of the new Catholic dynasty which Prince James's birth represented, a group of Protestant nobles encouraged King James's son-in-law/nephew, William of Orange, who was married to the king's elder daughter Mary, to essentially overthrow James and take the throne. I have a video on how this all happened, which I'll leave linked for you, so I'm not going to get sidelined into explaining it here. But rumours were put out that the baby prince was a changeling smuggled into the birthing chamber in a warming pan. Yes, it's as ludicrous as it sounds. And James II did indeed lose the throne, which was taken by William and Mary, then later by Mary's younger sister Anne. James, his queen, and their son were forced into exile in France, with the whole sequence of events becoming known as the Glorious Revolution. This meant that the little boy's right to the title of Prince of Wales was no longer recognised within Britain and Ireland. However, foreign royal powers and those who supported the rights of King James to the crown, known as the Jacobites, did acknowledge it, and the dispute between the Jacobite royals living in exile in mainland Europe and those who actually held the crown back in Britain would roll on for decades. For now, though, let's stay focused on Prince James. He was raised as a Catholic in the Chateau of Saint-Germain-en-Laye in France, where he was joined in 1692 by a younger sister, Princess Louise. Now, this video is about princes of Wales who never became king, and James wouldn't have put himself into that category, for he would have said he became James III at the age of 12, when his father died in September 1701, and some of the European royal families, including Louis XIV of France, recognised him as such. I, however, don't think you are really the monarch if you daren't set foot in your realm, most people there don't recognise you as the sovereign, and you have no access to the money, castles, palaces, and other accoutrements of the crown, so I'm putting him on my list. His inability to hold the throne was further enshrined in law by the 1701 Act of Settlement passed in the English Parliament, which barred Catholics from being sovereigns and vested the succession in the German Hanoverians, who were the descendants of James I's daughter. You can argue the so-called James III's position out in the comments if you like, though. It's certainly an interesting debate. The boy continued to live at Saint-Germain-en-Laye with his mother as his regent, and was known in his would-be kingdom as the Pretender. As he aged, this title became the Old Pretender. His half-sister, Queen Mary, had died in 1694. However, his cousin/brother-in-law, William III, continued to hold the throne until his own death in 1702. At this point, as I've mentioned, James's other half-sister, Anne, became the recognised queen. James gained his majority in 1706, and in 1708, with the support of the French, he attempted to land in Scotland to foment a rebellion which would regain his father's throne. It was a complete failure. A bout of measles on the part of the Pretender meant that the expedition had to be delayed, giving Queen Anne's forces time to react. Despite reaching Scottish waters, James and his soldiers never made landfall, and returned to France to escape an Anglo-Dutch fleet. He now joined the French army and served with distinction at the battles of Oudenarde and Malplaquet in 1708 and 1709. In 1712, his 19-year-old sister, Princess Louise, died of smallpox. By the by, that's what killed their sister Mary too. And in 1714, when his half-sister Anne was dying, he was petitioned to change his religion to Protestantism by two of her leading ministers, Lords Oxford and Bolingbroke, so that he could take the throne upon her death, but he refused. The crown then went to the Hanoverians that August with the accession of George I. James hadn't given up on a restoration though, and in the summer and autumn of 1715 there was a famous attempt to put him on the throne. Despite uprisings in Scotland and England though, and the fact that he came to Scotland himself in late December, staying for 5 weeks and presenting himself as king, the rebellion failed. He was a disappointment to those who saw him, failing to inspire enthusiasm or loyalty, and soon many Jacobite supporters had deserted him, while the Hanoverians mounted a strong defence. By early February, it was all over. James skulked back to France in secret and never set foot in Britain again. Thanks to Franco-British peace negotiations, he couldn't go back to his old life at Saint-Germain-en-Laye, and instead he stayed in Avignon for a time before moving to Rome, where he spent most of the rest of his life living off a papal pension. His mother passed away in 1718, and in September 1719 he married Maria Clementina Sobieska, daughter of Prince James and Hedwig of Neuburg and granddaughter of the King of Poland. The couple had 2 sons, Charles, born on New Year's Eve 1720, and Henry, born in 1725. After that, the marriage broke down, largely due to Clementina's objections to Protestants in her husband's household. She went into a convent for a time, and though things were patched up to an extent in early 1728, it was never a solid union. She died in 1735. The Old Pretender lived on for over 30 years, though they were full of disappointment, as his eldest son tried and failed to retake the throne on his behalf. The pair then became estranged, and James sank into ill health, which left him a bedridden invalid during his final decade. When he at last passed away in Rome on New Year's Day 1766, he was buried in the famous St. Peter's Basilica. As for James's firstborn son, Charles, he's in even more of a grey area than his father. The Old Pretender had, however briefly, been recognised as the Prince of Wales by Britain. Charles never was. He was the Jacobite Prince of Wales, but given that I don't really see his father as ever having been a king, Bonnie Prince Charlie, as he is popularly known, wasn't, by my standards, really a Prince of Wales. I'm adding him into the list anyway, though, for the sake of thoroughness, and because he has an interesting story. I'll let you decide, however, if you think he really makes the cut. As we've heard, Charles was born at the end of 1720 and had a younger brother called Henry. Named Prince of Wales by his father, he was raised in Rome and Bologna in the very broken family I have just described. He was noted as having behavioural problems, even hitting and threatening to kill his tutor on one occasion in 1733 because the man disciplined him. He could show considerable charm as well, though, and by his teenage years was seen as the better face of the Jacobite cause than his father, who he never saw again after January 1744. Having travelled to France to try to muster up an invasion force with French support, Charles proved unwilling to listen to good advice about his prospects and had to borrow heavily to equip a small army made up of French, Scots and Irish. This force was ready by the summer of 1745. The titular prince came to Scotland that July, and after an inauspicious start, had managed to raise a considerable army by the end of August. There were some early successes. The prince and his men took Edinburgh in mid-September, where he was first referred to as Bonnie Prince Charlie on the 17th of that month, and defeated the English at Prestonpans on the 21st. They then set off for London on the 31st of October. They got as far south as Derby, but his supporters balked when they realised no French or English Jacobite support was coming, and they forced a retreat back into Scotland, which began on the 6th of December. Despite victory at the Battle of Falkirk in January 1746, Charles proved a poor leader who was given to needless risk-taking and increasing melancholy and even drunkenness. At the Battle of Culloden on the 16th of April, his army was decisively beaten by the forces of the Duke of Cumberland, son of George II. The young pretender, as he became known, went on the run through Scotland, disguising himself as a woman on occasion to evade capture, and finally boarded a ship back to France on the 20th of September. Back on mainland Europe, Charles found himself expelled from France in 1748, under the terms of the Treaty of Aix-la-Chapelle, which marked the end of the Austrian War of Succession. Over the next few years, he travelled around the continent trying to muster up support for another invasion, even spending periods back in France and a few days in London, in disguise of course, where he visited in 1750 and was received into the Anglican Church. His demanding nature at best put off or at worst offended many of those who might have helped him, though, while British diplomatic pressure made it harder and harder to shelter him. No successful invasion or coup was ever carried out. His personal life was no more successful than his attempts to gain the throne. Brides were suggested, but Charles had an inflated idea of his own worth, imagining he could secure one of Louis XV's daughters. He had an affair with his first cousin, the married Marie de la Tour d'Auvergne, which resulted in a short-lived son born in 1748, and relationships with other women too. The most important was a Scottish lady called Clementina Walkinshaw, who had nursed him through a bout of illness in early 1746, and with whom he had a daughter, Charlotte, born in Liège in 1753. Charles was by now sinking into alcoholism and depression, though, and Clementina and Charlotte left him in 1760. When his father died in 1766, he was not recognised as Charles III by any major powers, and most of his British servants had left their drunken and abusive employer by the end of the decade. He finally married to Princess Louisa of Stolberg-Gurdon, a woman over 30 years his junior, in 1772, but the couple had no children and separated in 1780. In 1784, he legitimised his daughter Charlotte and named her his heir and the Duchess of Albany, though this title was recognised by very few, and given that he never married her mother, I can't see how him declaring she was legitimate genuinely changed her status. Had she, in some bizarre alternate reality, ever tried to seize the British throne, I think the circumstances of her birth would have been a millstone around her neck that she would never have been able to shake off. Charles's life had been a series of disappointments, some of them the result of the situation into which he was born, and some the result of his own flaws, ineptitudes, and poor decisions. He died in January 1788 after suffering a stroke, and his remains were eventually interred in St. Peter's in Rome. His daughter died the following year, having not had any legitimate children, and his brother Henry never claimed to be Henry IX, nor did he have any offspring, so that to all intents and purposes, his passing in 1807 brought the legitimate Jacobite succession to an end. The claim passed to some distant cousin, but no one ever pursued it again. For our final Prince of Wales, who never made it to the throne, we're going to need to backtrack a little, as this man was alive at the same time as Bonnie Prince Charlie, and was the alternate Prince of Wales. This was Prince Frederick Louis, son of George II and Caroline of Ansbach. Born in Hanover in January 1707, Frederick was not initially a British royal, and did not become one until the death of Queen Anne in 1714, when his grandfather, George I, became the new king of England, Wales, Scotland and Ireland. While his grandfather, parents and siblings departed for England, however, the 7-year-old Frederick was left behind as the dynasty's representative in Hanover. He was taught English to prepare him for his eventual rule, but he remained outside the country until adulthood. The result of this long separation was a severe weakening of familial ties with his immediate relations, and Frederick and his father would go on to have one of those famously bad Hanoverian father-son relationships. In 1727, George I died, and Frederick became first in line to the throne. Still, it was only after he caused a diplomatic disaster through his interference in the marriage negotiations between two of his cousins, one from Prussia, one from Brandenburg-Ansbach, that he was suddenly spirited out of Hanover one night, in the middle of a ball no less, by his father's agents, and brought to London in December 1728. There, he was created Prince of Wales on the 8th of January 1729. He was kept on a tight financial leash, tight by royal standards that is, by his father and given his own household. But when the king went to Hanover, it was Queen Caroline who was repeatedly named his regent, not Frederick, straining relations between parents and son even further. Frederick made his home at Carlton House, which he purchased in 1733, and proved to be a great supporter of the arts, whether it was music, literature, theatre or painting. He also had affairs and illegitimate children, including a short-lived son and daughter by Anne Vane, one of his mother's ladies-in-waiting, who were born in 1732 and 1733. The financial constraints his father placed him under, and their generally poor relationship, led to Frederick becoming the focus of opposition to the king, and he was also angered that a suitable bride had not been found for him. This was rectified in 1736 when he married the teenaged and very pliable Augusta of Saxe-Gotha. She immediately declared she would always do what he told her, and his income was raised to £50,000 a year. The couple went on to have a successful marriage and welcomed 8 children, with a 9th born after Frederick's death. Family relations broke down completely in 1737 though, and Queen Caroline wouldn't even see Frederick before her hideously painful and protracted death that November. I have a video all about that, which I'll leave linked for you. By the end of that year, the Prince and Princess of Wales had moved to Norfolk House, and Frederick found himself excluded from his father's presence and almost all official business. He continued to associate with Whig and Tory politicians though, and to show himself off to the people in an effort to build and maintain his popularity. Relations with the king were publicly patched up in 1742, and the Waleses moved their growing family to Leicester House, where his parents had lived as prince and princess, in 1743. But the family was still fragmented, and as we've already heard, it was his brother, the Duke of Cumberland, who got all the glory for defeating the Jacobites in 1746, which can only have ticked Frederick off all the more. The Prince of Wales continued to try to build up political alliances in England in anticipation of becoming king. However, he underestimated his father's longevity and overestimated his own. In March 1751, he was taken ill with a pain in his side, but seemed to recover after a fortnight. Then, on the 20th of March, the very day his doctors prescribed him safe, he suddenly died at 9:30 that night, aged just 47. After what was a slightly underwhelming funeral, considering that he was the heir to the throne, he was buried in the Hanoverian vault within the Henry VII Chapel in Westminster Abbey. A small, faded plaque on the floor is now the only marker of his grave, though to be fair, such plaques are the only markers any of the Hanoverians in that vault have. The cause of death was possibly a burst abscess in one of his lungs, though a story has taken hold that it was the result of a blow from a cricket or tennis ball. His father lived on until 1760, when Frederick's eldest son inherited the throne as George III. His widow survived him until 1772. And so ends the stories of the princes of Wales who never became king, for every boy and man who has held the title since then has gone on to ascend to the throne. Let me know in the comments below if you think the old and young pretenders should have made the list, and for more on the royal families you've heard about in this video, try one of these options next. Whatever you select, please enjoy. And until next time, keep learning.